Right. Okay. Well, thanks, Alaric, for the first half.
You're welcome.
Now, I know the Bible nowhere near as much as Alaric does. What I'm going to talk about is much more related to scholars' views and what scholars claim about the Gospels. I'm slightly sorry for that title, the Invention of Jesus. That was just my running title when I started putting these names together, and I actually think it's a lot more provocative than I really wanted it to be. Right, now, basically, the aim is to show where the gospel story does come from. So that's what I'm aiming for, but I've sort of broken that down a bit, and these are the points, I guess, that I hope people get out of this. In the 1st and 2nd century, there were many Christianities and many Gospels, and many Christs and many Jesuses. And of these, one version of Christianity survived, and 4 Gospels survived in terms of canonicity and being recognised as valid. Now, these particular Gospels, these 4 Gospels, have literary histories, they have intertextual relationships, and sources behind the Gospels can be detected. The other point that I guess I'd like people to take away is that there are no extra Christian sources which are relevant to the life of Jesus. There are 0. And the other point, and this is the contentious one, although I'm not sure that this is even contentious, the Gospels look like historical fiction. I think even people who concur that there are factual elements within them still agree that they look like historical fiction. So, yeah.
When you say no extra Christian sources, you mean sources external to Christianity?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
It'll become clearer as we look at that in more detail. Now, I just want to say, I just want to refer to something that Albert Schweitzer said 100 years ago. He pointed out that people who have attempted to study the historical Jesus have always constructed Jesus in their own image, in a sense, but in their own cultural image, certainly. And so Jesus varies from culture to culture and from scholar to scholar. And I think this is due to the creedal positions that people often take into their studies. And I've mentioned a couple there. The creedal position of fundamentalists. In particular, it's spelled out very clearly by this group called the Reformed Theological Seminary. This is a widely spread group of scholars in the United States. They start off with this assumption that the Bible is absolutely and finally authoritative as the inerrant Word of God. Now, any person who starts off with an assumption like that forfeits any claim to be considered an intellectual scholar or a seeker after truth. Someone who starts off with assumptions like that should be dismissed out of hand. Right? There's no question of that. However, there are also problems with mainstream biblical scholars. By mainstream, I mean the people at the major and elite universities. Generally, these people have come from a religious background, even though it's usually quite liberal. And as an example of that, I put up a quote which I got from the Uniting Church website. So this is in Uniting Church in Australia. It says, "The Uniting Church's beliefs are drawn from the Bible and from the Apostles and Nicene creeds." So these people themselves are going in with a set of assumptions, right? And that's a problem. if you're seeking after truth and you go into it with a background of truths which are asserted, and you're not prepared to throw away right at the start, then you've got a problem. Now from here on in, I sort of want to whistle through this as quickly as I can, because there's a lot of material to cover, and we want to get through it fairly quickly. Now, firstly, I'm looking at the sources about Jesus' life, and I've listed here a list of major writers from the 1st and 2nd centuries, and whether or not they actually refer to Jesus. And these are writers who had a specific interest in the sort of events that were happening in Palestine at that time, or in the philosophy that was attributed to Jesus. These people should have been interested, but we don't get any mention until possibly Josephus, 60 years after the supposed death of Jesus, and that is extremely fleeting, and most of it is agreed by all scholars, including people of Christian scholars, to be a forgery. So it's another 10 years or so before we start to get fleeting references to Jesus or to the Christ. And I mentioned there that Tacitus has a very fleeting reference to the Jesus of Galilee. In fact, it's not the Jesus of Galilee, it was a Jesus who was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And there are a few other references to Christianity. These are a long time after Jesus' life. They contain information that could have and probably was obtained from Christian communities, not from any other sources. They're just a sentence or two or a paragraph, very general information, and offer no confirmation or additional information about Jesus. Now let's just move on a bit. Again, here's a list of Christian writers, and the question here is, do they refer to Jesus' life, or do they refer to the Christ that Paul talked about? And we see early on people are talking about the Christ, and these documents refer to the Christ, but they do not refer to Jesus of Galilee. As Alaric has pointed out, Paul and the other New Testament epistles, they talk about the Christ, but not Jesus of Galilee. There are no geographical references, no details of his life. Same with Clement, writing in 95. The Didache, which I think was possibly even a bit earlier than that. Ignatius of Antioch is the first writer who gives a fleeting reference to Jesus. So references to Jesus himself start a long time after this talk of Christ. Now, Gospels are a completely different story, so this is the other sort of Christian literature. There are stacks of Gospels. There's an unbelievable number of Gospels. I think some writers claim there are up to 80 Gospel or Gospel-like writings. What I've made here is a list of Gospels from the first couple of centuries that seem to date from the 1st or 2nd century. Dates there, whether or not they're complete. There's more that I've actually added as well. A lot of these are lost. Of that vast list, only 4 was accepted by the church as saying the things they wanted to say. The church, incidentally, or the Christian community, was selective in the Gospels, that it, not just the Gospels, the writings that it perpetuated over the next 1,000 years. So a lot of these Gospels were lost because they didn't want them. Okay, why is there such a proliferation of Gospels in the first couple of centuries? And I only listed the first 2 centuries. You know, there are many more Gospels which people think are written even later, the 3rd century, sometimes into the 4th. Why was there such a variety of Gospels? And the reason is that there was a variety of early Christian sects. Some of the first references that we've got is that Paul and the Jerusalem church had different ideas. They were somewhat at loggerheads as to their version of Christianity. Paul himself warns about other Jesuses, so obviously in Paul's time there were sects which disagreed with each other. I could even add to this list that you've got the Christianity of John on one hand, the Gospel of John, as opposed to the Christianity of the other 3 Gospels. They're completely different. Again, we've got another sect. And then there are some named early Christian sects which certainly flourished in the 2nd century, if not the 1st. So Docetism claimed that Jesus was just a phantom. He only seemed real. That's what the Greek means. Dokein means to seem. So that was an early sect. Adoptionism was the idea that Jesus was adopted by God. He wasn't the begotten Son of God. He was adopted by God at his baptism. The Ebionites were a particular type of Jewish Christian, and they didn't think Jesus was divine. He was some sort of Messiah figure, but not divine. And Gnosticism that's a wide range of sects in its own right. And they weren't monotheistic either, the Gnostics. Typical Gnosticism believed that there was a wicked God and then there was a good God, and a conflict between the two. Anyway,
and the wicked one survived.
Christians aren't monotheist either. They have the Trinity. They believe in 3.
Well, that's what I would say.
That's what Muslims say.
But actually, okay, it's another topic. Yeah, I agree with that. Or I can see sense in that. So, what was the situation prior to 180 of the Christian era, or the Common Era? You could believe anything and you could write anything you liked about Jesus. There were no historical constraints. The field was open. Right? And in that year, or around about 180 of the Common Era, Irenaeus, who was Bishop of Lyon, I think, decided that there were 4 Gospels that would be considered authoritative or authentic. I could cynically say that his reason for nominating 4 was because there are 4 directions of the compass, which was what he actually said. But I don't want to be that flippant. I think there was a bit more thought into the selection of these 4 Gospels. It's because they could be made to conform with the emerging orthodoxy. Right. Okay, so just moving on to modern scholarly views of the Gospel. Now, my first 2 statements are a bit whimsical and reflect my cynicism here. So, all the Gospels are reliable except for the 80 or so non-canonical Gospels. right? And the second statement, the canonical Gospels are historical, except for most of the bits of them. Now, that's enough for the cynicism, but I really do think that those two statements do capture the essence of modern scholarship on the Gospels. But statements that I think I can make a little bit more seriously. Modern scholars accept that the Gospels were written 35 to 100 years after Jesus' life and death. They're anonymous. They are not by witnesses. Generally, they are not historical. They're generally rejected as being mainly historical by scholars. 75% of Jesus' words are inauthentic. Now that's a contentious statement which could be unpacked at length, and if anyone's interested in that, we can pursue that later. Generally, modern scholars tend to reject the miraculous in the Gospels. In fact, they've done that for 200 years, since the Enlightenment. When a new approach to biblical studies arose. Continuing on with scholars' views of the Gospels, it's recognised that the Gospels contradict each other, and I've just mentioned a few interesting examples. Firstly, Jesus' birth year differs by up to 10 years, or at least 10 years between the two Gospels that mention his birth. The day of crucifixion differs between John and the other Gospels. I can't remember the details. I think John had him crucified on a Wednesday, and the other Gospel writers on a Thursday or a Friday. Depended on, in one case it was the day before Passover, and on the others it was before the day of preparation of Passover. So it can be discovered. Quite an interesting difference you see between Mark and John. In Mark, Jesus is a secret Messiah, but in John, right from the beginning, he's an all-triumphant God figure in John. Very different views of Jesus. The other thing that, next point, that scholars agree on, the Gospels, like all of the New Testament, the Gospel documents have been corrupted in little measure and in large measure. And I've just mentioned a few. There are a few examples there. The post-resurrection details in Mark, the last 12 verses, are a later addition to Mark. They're not in the original version or the earliest copies. And a couple of well-known additions to John, late additions to John, story of the woman taken in adultery. It's ironic because it's one of the most popular Bible stories, where Jesus says, "He who is out without sin, let him be the first to cast a stone at this woman." That's a later addition, 4th century or so. And the final chapter of John, the very last chapter of John, is a later addition. And, that list could go on and on and on. In fact, there are wild estimates that there are 300,000 to 400,000 variations in the textual traditions that we have, which is much, much larger than the number of words in the New Testament.
David, why do you think if certain event didn't really occur, so many people at that stage are writing about a character, be it fictitious or not, in a very compelling way, which is not connected to any power structure either, or political structure of the society?
Why?
Yeah, just a thought. If there are so many different things being written about a personality, which is not connected to power structure or
Well, I think it is related to a power structure.
Right.
I disagree with your claim that it's compelling, right? I mean, there were 80 or so Gospels, as I mentioned. They disagreed with each other. I mean, the four that we have disagree with each other. They're not, depends how compelling.
But
But-
they are talking about a single character, right?
Maybe, presumably. However, it is related to a power structure. It came, Christianity appealed mostly to the dispossessed classes of the Roman Empire and those without hope. So I think there are real sociological reasons which are understood quite clearly, but it's a little bit outside the scope
I'd just
here.
like to add to what he's saying. He was referring to one single person, but actually the name Christ is in Greek. The name is meaning Messiah, so it could be anybody.
All right.
No,
Doesn't
yeah,
have to be-
Christ,
At the end, mate.
can we go on and
You-
leave
you're
most of the
sure.
discussion to the end? Simply because we've got to get through this fairly quickly. I know this is horrible and boring stuff. Okay, scholars tend to agree on at least this much about the gospel Jesus. Mainstream scholarship claims he existed, as Bart Ehrman will point out interminably. They also think he was probably born to people called Mary and Joseph. That, I think, is a slightly wild one. Scholars are pretty convinced that he was baptised by John the Baptist, and also that he was a failed apocalyptic prophet, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and some scholars actually think he resurrected, although I think they don't like to talk about this. So that's not talked about so much. There are things that could be added to this list, not many though. It's thought that he gave a pronouncement on divorce, and it's thought that he was sort of a wisdom teacher or an ethics teacher. Okay, and that's probably more or less most of what scholars will agree on about Jesus. Now, I'm hoping we can go through this fairly quickly, because the idea I want you to get from this chart is that the Gospels, which you can see in the middle there, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, actually have a literary history and they have a relationship to other documents. So I'm listing arrows showing a connection in terms of some sort of dependency. It can be direct quotation, or it can be a looser quotation, or it can just be a cultural setting. Now, not all of this is accepted by all elite scholars, okay? I put this together and not all of it's accepted. For example, I've got this arrow from Josephus to Luke, implying that Luke was familiar with Josephus and used material that he learned from Luke. That's a claim that's been in and out of favour over the last 100, 200 years. It's actually coming back into favour, and I personally don't see how it can be denied, actually. It seems quite strong to me. Now, you'll notice here that I've got Mark as the earliest gospel, written around the year 70, maybe a bit before that, and that's something that gospel scholars are pretty confident about. And Mark was used as a source document for Matthew and Luke. They copied him often verbatim, without acknowledgement. Now, Matthew and Luke also appear to have copied another document, again, often verbatim, largely verbatim, which is actually a hypothetical document. We don't have this, and it's called Q. And that's just a list of sayings, or mainly a list of sayings, with very little narrative detail other than the sayings. So these are, this is here simply to show you that the documents do have sources, they do have interrelationships, and these can be studied. One contentious thing I've noted there is that Mark had some knowledge either of Paul's letters or Paul's philosophy or Paul's world or Paul's theology. And quite frankly, I don't see how he couldn't have had, because he probably was writing in that part of the Hellenized world, which was Paul's sphere, from Antioch up to through Asia Minor into Greece. Mark was probably writing in this area. He was, and you know, I suspect he was familiar with the Christ that Paul was promulgating in the churches. Okay. However, that's a contentious one. However, more and more scholars are coming to believe that Paul's letters were known at least to Luke. Okay, moving on if we can. Now, so the question here is, where did Mark, the first gospeler, the first evangelist, where did he get his stories from? Where did he get his ideas from? One thing to note about Mark is that it looks like historical fiction. It reads like religio-historical fiction. And there are religious precedents for that in the Old Testament literature. I've mentioned there Daniel, Esther and Job, but I'm less familiar with the so-called apocryphal Old Testament writings at the time, but I think they're the same genre. But Daniel I find quite interesting. I think that's quite similar to the style of historical fiction that Mark is presenting. Second point there, Mark looks like it's written somewhat in the mould of Greco-Roman hero biography and romance. I won't say more about that, but if anyone wants to ask, we can talk about it. One important thing is the third point. Mark and the other Gospels, they're all written by an omniscient third-person narrator who knows about private conversations and I think in some cases even what people are thinking. Examples here are where Mark talks about the temptations of Jesus. How did Mark know? You know, what happened there? And, you know, if you read through Mark, I'm sure you'll find many examples where you wonder, how could Mark possibly know that? You know? Mark also contains allegory. An example there is Jesus cursing a fig tree because it didn't bear fruit. It's widely interpreted as an allegory. It's a bizarre story, and allegorical value is the only value that can be attributed to it. The next point I mentioned there is intercalation, or the interweaving of plots, and I think this is a brilliant literary feature of Mark. It would make him a great Hollywood writer, but not such a good writer of history. And Peter's denial is a good example of that. So at one point you have Peter and Jesus talking, and Jesus said, look, you're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter says, no, I never do it. Then they go off, Jesus gets arrested, stuff happens, bits of the trial going on. Someone says to Peter, you know Jesus, and he denies it. You know, another interruption. You know, the story of the denial is interwoven with the other plots, and in the end the cock crows and Jesus' denial becomes apparent. So that's not the way that an historian would tell it. It's brilliant dramatic writing. Another 2 features of Mark that I want to stress in particular are the parallel structures, the actual structure used to construct the ministry, and the very bottom one is Patia, or the use of the Old Testament. So what was accepted practice at the time for Jewish writers was to take an Old Testament story and rewrite it in a completely different context. Quite similar to the way that Romeo and Juliet was rewritten as West Side Story, and also it's alluded to in Mark Twain. So they're completely different tellings of the same story. So that's the idea of Patia. Yes, sir.
What's midrash, please?
I don't know the difference.
Sexually transmitted disease.
I don't know the difference between Pesha and Midrash.
Yeah, but what is
That
it?
went in for like 10 minutes now.
They refer to the same sort of thing, the recasting of old,
Yeah, but what is it? What is midrash? A definition, please.
the recasting of Old Testament stories in a different setting.
Oh.
So Pesha, Midrash, Haggadah and Halakha are all names which I think technically differ a little bit, but I don't know the meanings of them, but they all are basically retelling old stories, reinterpreting it and giving it a new setting. I think you could look up Wikipedia and you'll find this out, and but for our purpose, it's just retelling an Old Testament story, and those two are quite important. I want to look here at how Mark used parallels and cycles to construct his ministry narrative. So the Gospel of Mark consists mainly of two sections, people say, the ministry and then the passion. And the ministry is constructed largely from these two cycles of 5 miracles, which sort of the scholars claim are repeating each other here. They both start off with a miracle which involves power over water, which apparently contemporary readers would have assumed to be similar to Moses' power over the Red Sea. And this is interpreted as, in terms of Old Testament retelling. They both end up with feeding of 5,000 and then a repeat performance where Jesus feeds 4,000. So there are the two of these miraculous feedings. These are reminiscent of the children of Israel being fed in the desert with manna from heaven after they'd escaped from bondage in Egypt. Now scholars also point out that these cycles are reminiscent of the Elijah-Elisha miracle stories. I've read that. I don't understand it. I'm not a scholar. All I can say is that's what I've read, and scholars seem, fairly confident that these miracle stories are retellings of the Elijah-Elisha type stories. So moving on, I'm sorry if this is taking too long. An example of Pesha. This is how Mark constructed his passion story, Passion of Christ. He's taken bits and pieces from the Old Testament, mainly Psalms, but I've got a slide that didn't quite work there, but mainly Psalms, but also Isaiah and some other writings. Little bits from here and there, and pasted them all together and turned it into a passion narrative. One I find quite interesting is that the bottom one in the top segment, vinegar to drink, where the Gospelists talk about how Jesus called for something to drink and he was given vinegar, a sponge soaked in vinegar. That actually is, that comes from the Old Testament as well. I mean, you might think, oh, that's a lovely graphic detail that the evangelists have put in the Gospels. But in fact, that comes from the Old Testament. So all these bits and pieces are cobbled together to give you a narrative. That's how Mark constructed the Passion. Okay. So if it was based on a true event, it was retold in a manner that was much truer to the Old Testament than to that other event, presumably. Now, I want to talk here, just mention on this slide where the gospel story came from. Now, the oldest gospel traditions, I would claim, are the Gospel of Thomas, which scholars sort of say is probably somewhere between 50 and 150 in date. But this date is achieved by hand waving like I'm doing now. Right? They say, look, it looks older than anything else we see in the Gospels, including Q. It looks older. Yeah. Now, on that, I don't know why they don't give it an older date. And this actually, you can go and read for yourself, or you can listen to it on YouTube. It's really sort of nice to listen to, but it's certainly a primitive bit of writing compared to these other pieces of writing, Mark and Matthew, Luke and John. So it's basically a list of sayings. It overlaps partially with Matthew and Luke, and partially with the hypothetical Q document. So I'm saying the development of the gospel story began with these sayings type documents, Q and Thomas, which are sayings with very little narrative, or none in the case of Thomas. And a lot of scholars have said they're typical cynic wisdom. They look like the philosophy of mendicant cynic philosophers who were active and popular in the Hellenic world at this period. Now, Mark, to this sort of philosophy, to this sort of writing, added a baptism for Jesus, and he ended up with a crucifixion for Jesus. So Mark starts with a baptism, ends with a crucifixion. And that alone has interesting implications for Mark and versions of Christianity that placed a lot of emphasis on Mark and rejected the idea that Jesus was begotten of God. They say Jesus' godlike connection began at baptism and ended with his death. Now Matthew and Luke, who did actually incorporate Mark into them, they added birth, childhood, resurrection, post-resurrection. They added all that, and they developed the semi-divine status of Jesus, the concept that he was begotten by God. So they added that. That was added on to the sort of picture that Mark presents. And with John, John's a bit of a loopy gospel, actually. He added the full divinity of Jesus. He added Gnostic elements, and he added the concept of the Logos. Now, I've presented this as a linear progression. John's not really linear. He'd be out here to the side, not really linear. His material does seem to be, it does seem to take the type of Christ, type of Jesus presented in Matthew and Luke and doll it up quite a bit and make it fully God, coexistent and co-eternal with God. I just want to touch on now some of Bart Ehrman's arguments against the theory that Jesus is mythical. He spelled these out apparently in his latest book, which I haven't read. Okay, I'm responding here to things that he's published in popular media. For example, there's a Huffington Post article where he actually says this. Bart Ehrman says this. We have numerous independent accounts of his, that is Jesus' life, in the sources lying behind the Gospels in Aramaic, and that can be dated to within just a year or two of his life. That is an amazing statement. That is, I cannot believe that statement, because we don't. It's absolutely clear we don't. To me, this I find it hard to interpret this statement as something other than mischievous mendacity. You probably had a bad day or something when you wrote this, because it's just not true. The next thing I've noted, I'm mentioning just a few things here that are the things that Bart Ehrman mentions in interviews, and as I say in this Huffington Post. Now, Alaric has talked about what did what did Paul mean when he referred to James, the brother of Jesus, and Bart Ehrman sort of says this reference to James, the brother of the Lord, validates the gospel stories. How he draws that inference, I have no idea. It could validate any story you make up by that criterion. There's no suggestion that the brother of James is the Jesus of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Another point that Ehrman goes on quite a lot about in interviews. These are his best arguments for the historicity of Jesus. You know, when he's asked, give us your best shot. These are what he comes up with. He says that Jews didn't expect the Messiah to be crucified. Hence, Jesus was real. That's good logic, that is. The first thing to point out is that it's not clear that Jews were unreceptive to the idea of a crucified Messiah. It seems to be talked about in Daniel 9. Talmudic Judaism certainly develops the concept of a suffering Messiah, although that was a couple of hundred years later, about 200 years later. And Richard Carrier gives other examples, other literary examples, where Jews at the time of Jesus or before were familiar with the concept of a suffering Messiah and could accommodate it. And beyond that, I would say that the Jewish religion generally has changed every couple of generations from about the period from the time of the construction of the first temple and before. Judaism was continually changing every generation, you know, for the next 1,500 years. It was radical changes. It went from polytheism to monotheism during the exile, for example, and you know, not 1,000 years earlier as it's claimed, but the Jewish religion was continually changing, and there's no reason why it could not have changed in this period, and there's evidence that it did. And the other thing is something about Ehrman's logic. He's saying that a mythical crucified Messiah is unacceptable. If that's unacceptable, if you're talking about a mythical Messiah, then I would think it would be even more unacceptable for a real claimant to be the Messiah. Okay, so they're just a few comments on Bart Ehrman. I mention those because he's achieving a lot of prominence at present and getting a lot of airplay on this particular issue, and I'm not seeing sense in what he's saying. I'll eventually read the book when the paperback version comes out. It's half the price, hopefully. Okay, I just want to make a few conclusions, sort of reiterating the aims. In the first centuries, there were many Christianities, many Gospels, many Christs, many Jesuses. There are no non-Christian sources for Jesus. People constructed lives of Jesus as they wished. They could write whatever they like about Jesus, and it would gain currency and popularity for a while. The Gospels generally follow Old Testament models with Hellenistic elements.
Now, what does that mean? You mentioned that before, Hellenize. It's not a verb I know. It was the influence of
it's what Alaric talked about with the mystery, in particular the mystery religions which pervaded the Hellenised world after a couple of hundred years after the conquest of Alexander. So Alexander turned the world from Greece through to Babylon, up to in Persia, but not really including Persia. That all became Hellenized. Greek cities were founded. The Greek language became the language of the ruling and elite. The rulers were actually Greek. So the Ptolemaic dynasty of Greece for 400 years, they were Greek. They absorbed the local Egyptian culture to the extent that the Ptolemies kept marrying their sister Cleopatra for 300 years. But also the cultural institutions were Greek, so gymnasiums were formed, and there were Greek theatres, and Greek became the main language. But on top of this general cultural Greekisation, Hellenisation of that period, the religious practices also were somewhat bent towards a particular norm. It wasn't the traditional Greek religions. Although Alexander's theory was syncretism. He mixed Greek religions and whatever religions he found, he mixed them all together. So as mystery religions filtered back from the east of his empire to the west and became very popular in the western part of his empire. By west I don't mean Western Europe, I mean Egypt, Palestine and Anatolia, what we call the East, or what is called the East. But as it moved there from Persia, it was sort of receptive because of this idea of syncretism and religious tolerance, and the idea that all the religions were the same and you could shop and pick the religion you liked, as occurs with Protestantism in the United States at present. So that's sort of what I mean, and that's why I'm saying the Hellenic world provided a context for the sort of religion that Paul espoused, as Alaric went into. It was right for religious, for mystery religions, which were sort of a new veneer of interpretation on top of the older Jewish religion, which, I mean, the Jewish religion didn't even much have a soul or anything like that. There was no concept of a soul in the Jewish religion, but it sort of changed due to other influences over this time. So in the last, okay, just moving on, following on with this conclusion, in the last couple of centuries, I'm saying little has changed. We interpret the life of Jesus as we want to. Again, harking back to that statement of Schweitzer, that scholars have reconstructed lives of Jesus, or lives of Jesus, according to their cultural norms. And I would claim that the Gospels are indistinguishable from historical fiction. And I'll leave it there. I hope that wasn't too long.
Questions?
It is a sort of a complicated issue. Yeah. So, any questions? Actually, to me or Alaric, I think we can. Peter.
So you're talking about the origins of the early writings of the Bible, yeah?
The Gospels. Yeah. The Jesus story.
Why not look out of the tradition altogether to Egyptian mythology and Cyrus, and how a lot of that was stolen? The creation myth was stolen from
Yeah. Look, I sort of I concur with what Alaric has said about this, and well, it doesn't matter what I think. The scholarly consensus is that that's overblown when people start saying this story was taken and the name was changed from Osiris to Jesus, you know, and Christian proponents.
What's their argument that it's overblown now? I mean, religious texts are all plagiarized, as you showed in that.
Yeah, no, the problem is this. There's been a host of popular writers and popular filmmakers without a scholarly background, and their claims are not true, right? They claim that, I don't know, Mithras was born on the 25th of December, you know, of a virgin. And, you know, the historical, their claims are not true, right? In most cases, we don't know, we don't have those details. So that's the problem with those claims. They make claims which are not known. Yeah. Richard Carrier says the only two, he says we're only really certain about two of these mystery religions where we can go into it that depth and draw these close life event parallels with Christianity. One is the story of Zalmoxis and the other one I don't know about, but Christian proponents claim, well, you know, Osiris wasn't born of a virgin, you know, he was born some other way. It doesn't matter. In a sense, it doesn't matter. What we have is a context of saviour gods with a miraculous birth and some sort of death and afterlife and, you know, continuation of life after.